Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the characteristics of contemporary realistic fiction and the characteristics of multimedia and multi-genre texts. This is important for us because we are developing a familiarity with quality literature for children, including different genres, book awards, and trends. And we're also understanding and applying the literary criteria to fiction for children. So the texts that were assigned for these two genres, contemporary realistic fiction, we had The Birch Bark House, A Crooked Kind of Perfect, 8th Grade Super Zero, and Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe. So hopefully you have had the opportunity to read through your assigned book for that genre. And the books that were assigned for the multimedia texts are Milo, Sticky Notes and the Brain Freeze, Countdown, The Strange Case of Origami Yoda, and The Invention of Hugo Cabret. So I'm going to be referencing those texts in the lecture today because they were assigned, and I realize maybe you haven't had the chance to read them yet, and that's okay, but we still need to ensure that we have the understanding of the genres in order to be able to put this information to use both in our children's literature project and in our final exam. So, come on, there we go. What is contemporary realistic fiction? Well, contemporary realistic fiction, or CRF, so we don't have to keep with that tongue twister, are stories that didn't happen, though they may be based on the author's childhood experiences in real places or concern actual events, but they could have happened. So this is fiction in the truest sense. Although the things may seem real to us, and they might be inspired by events in people's histories and lives, they are 100% made up. So, I wanted to take a little bit of time to read an excerpt from The Birch Bark House by Louise Erdrich. If you have the Birch Bark House text, I'm reading from chapter 1. This is called The Girl from Spirit Island. The only person left alive on the island was a baby girl. The tired men who had come there to pick up furs from the Anishinaabe people stood uneasily on the rocky shore. The voyagers watched from a distance as the baby crawled in a circle, whimpering and pitiful. Her tiny dress of good blue wool was embroidered with white beads and ribbons, and her new moccasins were carefully sewn. It was clear she had been loved. It was also clear that the family who had loved her was gone. All of the fires in the village were cold. The dead lay sadly in blankets, curled as though sleeping. Smallpox had killed them all. The voyagers trembled at the thought that the disease might have already chosen one of them, too. Surely, they muttered, the baby had the sickness, too. She's sick, she looks tired, said one man, when she lay down against one of the blanketed figures. Let her sleep. Birds were singing, dozens of tiny white-throated sparrows. The trilling, rippling sweetness of their songs contrasted strangely with the silent horror below. First one, then the other of the men turned away. They got back into their canoes. As they paddled toward the next island, all were silent, thoughtful. Some wore hard expressions. One man had tears in his eyes. His name was Hat. He thought of his wife, and he decided he would tell her about the baby. If there was anyone in the world who'd go and rescue that little girl, it was his wife. He shivered a little as he thought of her. He couldn't help it. Tallow, she was called, and sometimes she scared him with her temper. Other times he was amazed at her courage. He grimaced in shame. Unlike him, his wife was afraid of nothing. So, that is just a little excerpt from that text, The Birch Bark House. And you can see how in the text it is based on very real events, but it's a fictional story. The young girl who they're talking about is not a real girl, although there may have been girls like her during this time and may have been inspired by a true story. The story is not based in truth. So it's the creation of Louise Erdrich's mind. So that is what contemporary realistic fiction is all about. CRF is one of the most popular genres. Why? Well, for elementary and middle school children, the stories and characters are familiar and thus acceptable and comfortable. For older students, because like the characters in the stories, they're coping with dramatic life changes and serious personal, family, and community problems. For less avid readers of all ages, CRF, quote, offers less of a gamble because the book contains elements familiar to the reader. Much of the groundwork already exists for a relationship to develop between child and character. So CRF is really popular because it's accessible. Unlike some of the other genres that we've looked at, like science fiction and fantasy and horror, those genres have conventions that might be confusing to first-time readers of the genre. So for example, there's a convention in a lot of science fiction and fantasy to kind of just drop people into the story without explaining anything about how characters got there. And this is hard for new readers because they might be frustrated because they don't know everything they think they should know as they read. When we're reading CRF, we are familiar with the circumstances. We're familiar with the settings. It takes place in a world that we understand, that we either are living in on our own, or that we have historical knowledge and awareness of. So we don't have to have that kind of jarring disconnect that we might have with some of the other kinds of genres. The 1960s were a really pivotal time for the development of young adult literature, which we've kind of hinted at a little bit in the past. Prior to 1960, CRF as we know it didn't really exist. Realistic ideas were meant to be clean and wholesome and didn't deal with controversial topics like divorce, sex, drugs, mental health, etc. Rather, the child protagonists acted within positive and protected situations. So if we think of characters like from pre-1960, I think of like Leave It to Beaver, right? Like that's a very 50s kind of family where the beaver character gets into trouble, but it's always something rather benign. His life is never really in danger. They don't tackle a lot of complicated subjects. It's a very kind of like wholesome depiction of a family with what the 1950s considers safe kind of problems to deal with. But we know that the 1960s were revolutionary for a lot of ways, and they were revolutionary for YA literature as well. So Harriet the Spy was one of the first pivotal CRF books, and it was published in 1964. Harriet was a non-traditional girl who was dressed in a sweatshirt, spied on her neighbors, was neglected by her well-to-do parents, and underwent psychotherapy. So she has a lot of different characteristics that were not traditionally present. We would have never seen the characters in Leave It to Beaver neglecting their kids or going to psychotherapy, right? Those topics were not broached at all. So there are some subgenres of CRF, and they all exist at the child, preteen, and teen levels. There's quite a few you can see. There's problem novels like life issues. That would be Aristotle and Dante discover the secrets of the universe, as well as A Crooked Kind of Perfect. Ethnicity or cultural fiction, action stories, animal stories, family stories, sports stories, sports fiction, survival stories, all kinds of different kinds of subgenres of contemporary realistic fiction. Some popular CRF titles, in addition to the ones that we were assigned for this class, some of the early books for older readers included The Chocolate War, The Outsiders, Go Ask Alice, and books by Judy Blume. More current well-known fiction includes things like Diary of a Wimpy Kid, The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, Because of Winn-Dixie, The Bridge to Terabithia, 13 Reasons Why, Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants, The Kite Runner. I could go on and on and on. As we talked about, this is a really popular genre, so there's a lot of different titles. So some additional reasons why CRF is important is because it can help readers understand different places, different experiences, and different perspectives, depending upon the contrast between the reader's lived experience and the story's main character. Still, though, the main character is roughly the age of the reader can also feel a connection. So this is what we talk about. Like, I'm a firm believer that reading helps us to develop empathy and understanding of other people, because it allows us to put ourselves in situations that we would never ever experience otherwise. And contemporary realistic fiction does that so well, because we can pick up a book like The Kite Runner that takes place in the Middle East and have this experience with this character and go through the trials and tribulations that he goes through and feel as though we've been there, even though we haven't left the safety of our own home. So it's a really good way for us to develop empathy and to understand other people's lives. It's been noted that young adults are at an age when what they read can affect them as at no other age, because they're very impressionable. CRF helps these readers to confront their own beliefs, to identify their own messages from the story, and to grow in their own ways. So this is a chance too for kids, young adults, to really explore and start to develop as a person. A lot of times in our lives, our young lives, we're subject to what our parents think, and their beliefs become our beliefs. So fiction is a way for us to explore those ideas and to start to develop our own beliefs and ideas about how the world works. Preteen and young adult CRF today ranges from the light to the very serious, including topics like inner city survival, gang life, teen suicide, AIDS, random violence, anorexia, terrorism, self-mutilation, white supremacy, and young adult fiction is, of course, more intense. It investigates some of these issues very, very deeply, because these are all issues that young adults are facing in our world today. And so CRF allows people to explore these ideas and to understand them in a different kind of way. The gritty, realistic topics listed above appear most often in the subgenre of problem novels, and sports and outdoor adventure novels may also be problem novels focused on sport, adventure, and also on life issues. So we see that a little bit in the 8th grade Super Zero story as well. Because of these different issues that the genre tackles, it's most clearly pushing against current social boundaries, and it's often the genre that receives the most challenge and controversy. A popular example is recently 13 Reasons Why, the Netflix show, which was based on a book, talks about suicide and sexual assault. The Absolute True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie is very kind of anti-family. There's cultural insensitivity, drugs, alcohol, gambling, offensive language, sex ed, sexually explicit, violence, and depictions of bullying. It's got a lot of different things. The Kite Runner, sexual violence, and people thought it was promoting Islam. The Perks of Being a Wallflower, drugs, alcohol, smoking, homosexuality, offensive language, sexually explicit, and Bless Me Ultima, similarly, drugs, alcohol, homosexuality, sexually explicit content, etc. We talked last week about banned books. Contemporary realistic fiction books are oftentimes banned or challenged because they address these complicated issues. And this is another area where people have a tendency to undermine the actual capability of young people to understand and sort of be aware of these things. And these issues are things that young folks deal with today. And so these books address these complicated and sensitive issues in an important way, but a lot of people, or not a lot of people, some people don't feel comfortable with that. So, talked a bit about contemporary realistic fiction. The next genre that we looked at is multimedia and multi-genre books. So we looked at Milo, Sticky Notes and Brain Freeze, Countdown, The Strange Case of Origami Yoda, and The Invention of Hugo Cabret. I have to say, out of all of these books, it was hard for me to choose. I mean, it is hard for me to choose my favorite. I really enjoyed The Invention of Hugo Cabret. I sat down and read it in the afternoon. I just couldn't put it down. The pictures are so beautiful and the story is so compelling. I also thoroughly enjoyed Countdown, although I had a harder time staying engaged with that one. I think it was because there was a lot of text when I wasn't really expecting a lot of text because I had just finished The Invention of Hugo Cabret. But I still really enjoyed the story. And if you enjoyed that story, it is a series. So the next book in the series tells a story from the sister's point of view, which I am kind of interested to explore. And the other two books were also very delightful. So multimedia or multi-genre books all share one key element. The illustrations in children's book do that. They illustrate or give an example of something in the story. In multimedia books, the images and other materials add to the story, presenting additional information that enriches the reading experience. So while we talked about children's books, illustrations are a key component. It helps give an example of something in the story. In multimedia books, the visuals are a part of the story, so it adds to the story. So the term has multimedia or multi-genre. These books are called a variety of different things. They've also been called hybrid texts, indicating the mix of words and illustrations. Other terms that have been used are mixed genre text, multi-genre text, and postmodern text. So nobody can really agree on the term to call them. I think multimedia / multi-genre is a good catch-all, but I just wanted you to be aware that some folks may call them different things. This is a really innovative genre, as I'm sure you realized when you were reading through these books. Works like the books that we were assigned for our class are unique among children's books. In a discussion about the Newbery Award-winning books, one librarian pointed out that such books need their own category because they're difficult to group. If we think about The Invention of Hugo Cabret, does it belong in the Newbery group, which focuses on the text, or the Caldecott group, which focuses on the illustrations? It did eventually win the Caldecott. So this is an image from The Invention of Hugo Cabret, just for some folks who weren't assigned this book. There's also a movie about this, a cartoon, or it's not a cartoon, an illustrated movie. It's really great. I'd check it out if I were you. Brian Selznick, who is the author of The Invention of Hugo Cabret, said, "It's not exactly a novel, not quite a picture book, not really a graphic novel or a flip book or a movie, but a combination of all of these things. And this is what makes these books so difficult to classify for the Newbery Award." Whatever the name, these books are kind of the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren of rebus texts, which we talked about earlier in the semester. Remember, we looked at an example of a rebus text from Benjamin Franklin. It has the images that fit together to tell us a story. We had a difficult time with that. In order to decipher a rebus text, the reader must be able to not only identify the picture, but also oftentimes has to know synonymous words that the picture represents in order to understand the sentence in which the picture appears. So for example, if we saw a picture of a small barrel, the reader needs to know another word for the small barrel is but in order to understand the barrel represents the conjunction but in the sentence. So this explains a little bit about why we had trouble reading rebus texts that we created 100 to 200 years ago. In addition to the poor image quality of the one that we looked at, there's just social context that we don't have anymore. We don't understand what some of those words mean because our culture has shifted. We use words differently. It would be just like if we created a rebus text today using modern images that people in the future may not be familiar with, right? Like rebus texts, today's hybrid books show children that there are different ways to read and different ways to compose a text. I really love this genre because it combines so many different elements to make this kind of collage of a text, which really kind of blows up the idea of what literature is, which I think is super important. especially for young readers, because a lot of times we're told what we should read and how we should read it and why we should read it. And texts like this challenge that idea and make us question more, like, what is the definition of literature? How do we define what texts are, or how do we define what literature is? And I really enjoy that about this genre of books. Most importantly, hybrid texts engage the reader on multiple levels and require the reader to pretty much work harder. These books can't really be read in a passive manner. The texts require the reader to learn to be linguistically flexible and adapt to new communication situations. So unlike picking up a traditional text and being able to read it from front to back and know exactly what's going to happen, these texts ask us to engage with different images, different kinds of text, different kinds of images, in addition to prose, to make meaning of something. So we're really engaging a whole bunch of different critical literacy kinds of skills that are challenging for readers, because it's not just as simple as picking up a book to read a section of prose, right? So how do we see this kind of flexibility or challenge in the selections for our class? In Sticky Notes and Brain Freeze or The Strange Case of Origami Yoda, a reader could skip past the sketches and the text that accompanies them, but the reader would miss out on information that enriches the story and further describes the characters. So we would miss out on details about who the characters are and what they're kind of doing and what their motivations may be. In The Invention of Hugo Cabret, it has a lot of pictures, but the reader has to examine the pictures and kind of read the progression of images in order to understand the story. If we took out the pictures, we would not really have a book with that. But just similarly, if we took out the text, we wouldn't be able to just read the pictures and understand the whole story. So we have to read them in conjunction with one another and see how that makes the story grow and develop. In Countdown, the use of newspaper articles and other print historical information requires the readers to make connections between that content and the story that's being told. So we see a lot of information about atomic bombs, because that's what's happening in the story. And I think we get a lot of info about the development of atomic bombs and just kind of what it was like to live during this time and how fearful people were. And my dog is shaking in the background. That's his big old floppy face flopping around. Sorry. But yeah, in Countdown, we get to see this really interesting kind of historical time chest that works together with the story to give us a really rich understanding of the culture and society at the time that we wouldn't have if we didn't have those additional documents. So, these books require the reader to perform some serious mental work to enjoy the story. And I think, too, this engages readers in a different kind of way. We're not just reading the story. And I think that this is an opportunity for students or for kids, young adults, who may have problems reading or feel like they're not very much of a reader. These, I think, are kind of good books to get them into, because it shows that, like, books don't just have to be boring words on a page. Not that books are boring words on a page, but, that's kind of the misconception for young people who don't like to read. This shows a different way to read that is just as challenging, if not more challenging, than reading a traditional text. So both contemporary realistic fiction and multimedia texts engage young adults in innovative, personal, and relevant ways. And these two genres also show us that text can look different and engage people in a variety of ways. So I think that these two genres, and really the coming genres for the week, are going to show us that books are so much more complex than we think, and books for young people have so many options, and there's a lot of great ways for us to get young people in. And this kind of goes back to what we talked about earlier in the semester when we wondered, like, how can we encourage young folks to read today when there are so many different distractions, technology, video games, Snapchat, TikTok, whatever. And these, I think, show us a way to engage different kinds of readers in different kinds of materials that will help to encourage more young people to read. So just a reminder, if you want some additional help in the class, I thought I changed this on the slide, sorry. You know I'm not in my office. My contact information is on our course Moodle page. Remember you should be working on your writing project for this, your children's literature project for the semester. I would love to hear from y'all about what you're doing. And of course, if you have questions or concerns, or there's anything that I can help you with, please reach out to me and let me know. And until next week, stay safe and stay healthy.